Well, here we are in 2026 and dealing with another visit from the Good Idea Fairy to the California State Legislature. Somehow, they got it into their heads that mandating ID requirements and signature required delivery for firearms, parts, and tools was going to stop the manufacture of homemade firearms. Now, as I was getting at in the intro, this legislation was essentially a reaction to homemade firearms becoming more and more common in criminal activities involving firearms, which was obvious to anyone paying attention. Most gun control laws operate on the basic idea that criminals are stupid and won't find new avenues to acquire weapons. So of course, homemade firearms would appear at more and more crime scenes. It would be intellectually dishonest to think that modern manufacturing techniques wouldn't allow that to happen. However, the entire premise for this law is that the streets are awash with blood because of homemade firearms. It completely ignores the fact that as a nation, overall, our violent crime rate has continued to trend downward since the early 90s. This is a nationwide trend too, not purely in states with restrictive gun laws, since I will get into that in another video. But anyway, criminals were obviously getting access to firearms before the current trend of homemade firearms. The idea that firearms cause criminality is the glaring flaw with most of these laws. This law in particular also seems to operate under the assumption that homemade firearms are a new thing. There's a long tradition of home-built firearms in the United States for entirely mundane, non-criminal reasons. And if you want to look at the contemporary criminal element in the 20th century, there are many examples of home-built firearms specifically built for criminal use around the world. But that's a big topic, and I promise I'll get to that one too, since it's actually pretty fascinating. So what does AB 1263 actually do? Firstly, it requires sellers to notify buyers that these existing restrictions exist via the mandatory notice and acknowledgement form. It creates a new misdemeanor offense under Penal Code 29186 that consolidates and codifies unlawful manufacture of firearms, essentially restating existing prohibitions all in one place. It expands civil liability so that people who aid, abet, or facilitate violations of these existing laws can be sued. There's language in it as well restricting the sale of dedicated firearms manufacturing, CNC machines, and 3D printers, but this is pretty much just going after one piece of equipment, the Ghost Gunner, which is a desktop CNC machine that's designed to perform the simple operations you need to finish 80% frames and receivers. They know that trying to regulate every commonly used tool in manufacturing would be essentially impossible. And if we're being real here, any desktop CNC machine capable of working with aluminum can do the exact same job. And finally, the point that we care most about as gun owners in California, because it directly affects us the most, is it adds new ID and shipping requirements for selling firearms parts and accessories. There's also some nonsense in there attempting to regulate 3D printer fires, which I won't bore you with, other than to say that California has essentially no ability to enforce these laws against anyone, other than if they were maybe trying to host those files from servers and distribute them in California. As you're watching this on the internet, you probably have some idea how impossible it is to take anything off of the internet once it's there. In effect, this law is an attempt mostly for California to create a new legal framework to try and sue people engaged in the business of firearms, and make life slightly more annoying for California gun owners. But how is this law going to affect the day-to-day of the average California gun owner? For the novice firearms owner who shops at local gun stores and the larger sporting goods chains, at most, this is one more annoying piece of paperwork when purchasing an accessory for a new firearm. Say you just picked up a new AR-15, or even a mundane hunting shotgun, and you wanted to swap out the stock. You're going to need to show ID and sign one more piece of paperwork. If you stood in line at the firearms counter at a big box store like Sportsman's Warehouse or Bass Pro, you know what a pain it is to purchase ammo. Now, unless they keep these forms up at the register, the most likely scenario is at most stores you'll have to wait in line at the already understaffed gun counter to purchase anything firearms related. But I'd also bet they put even more firearms accessories behind glass and make you ask for someone to go get them. Now, the law references Penal Code 30515A, which lists specific accessories that can render a firearm an assault weapon when combined with a detachable magazine. Standard rifle stocks, for instance, aren't on that list. Only thumbhole stocks, folding, or telescoping stocks are covered. However, there's also catch-all language in the bill covering any other device, tool, kit, part, or part set that is clearly designed and intended for use in manufacturing firearms. So if you're familiar with how Prop 65 went down, you know it was easier to slap a warning label on everything to avoid liability. The civil liability risk for vendors with this bill is so incredibly broad that I kind of suspect they'll err on the side of making you sign the acknowledgement form and provide ID for anything that can be construed as firearms parts or tools. Like I said though, this isn't preventing you from buying parts at your local store, it just makes it more annoying. Where this becomes a real pain in the rear is with online purchases. For online vendors, they have to collect a copy of your government-issued photo ID, verify that ID matches the shipping address exactly, get the customer to sign the acknowledgement, presumably electronically, and ship with signature required, and also accept any civil liability exposure if anything goes sideways downstream of that sale. Many online retailers are just going to stop shipping these items to California, just to avoid the added compliance burden and civil liability risk. For barrels specifically, it's even worse. SB 704 requires them to go through an FFL with a background check, so barrels will no longer be available for direct shipment. You'll need to purchase them in person at a licensed California gun dealer or ship it to your FFL from a vendor that's willing to deal with California at all. Though we have till July 1st, 2027 before the background check requirement goes into effect. You still have to ship it to an FFL in the meantime, and if you want a full breakdown on SB 704, let me know. The practical effect we're dealing with here is reduced vendor selection, since smaller vendors are just going to stop shipping to California, potentially higher prices since we're less able to shop around, longer wait times since verifying IDs probably isn't going to be a completely automated process for every vendor. For instance, I just placed an order with Midway USA for some parts I needed, and also to see what the new process was like for California sales. My takeaway is that it's a pointless annoyance. The order has to ship signature required, I had to click yes on the warning notice, upload a picture of my ID, and it takes them an extra day to verify your address. Now, will this law have any effect at all on criminal use of homemade firearms? Of course not. It's ridiculous to think that it would. Your average armed robbery and drive-by enthusiast isn't sitting at their gunsmithing bench and using their real ID to order parts from Brownells. And even if they were, it's not like those parts are serialized and associated with a specific person. Besides that, there are plenty of ways to source parts and complete firearms without going through legal channels, though I'm not sure YouTube would particularly like it if I told you all the different ways to do it here. Where there's a demand, there will be a supply, and even in countries with extreme restrictions in place on anything firearms related, the criminal or somewhat revolutionary element will find a way. I won't get in the entire 20th century history of home-built firearms around the world here, but I promise I'll get to it. Let me just provide one example in the US that most of us have heard about, the Glock auto switch. These are of course completely illegal machine gun conversion devices that I touched on in my Glock ban video. For a time, these were readily available on the big discount Chinese e-commerce websites like Temu or Wish. Now obviously they aren't quite as blatantly advertised as they used to be, but I recall seeing some pop up in my Instagram feed when Temu was aggressively running ads there. But they're still readily available and being imported completely illegally. On the completely legal side of things, all this law really is going to do is make it more annoying to get common firearms parts for enthusiasts like myself, and make it harder to source those little niche items from smaller vendors that don't have the staff or risk tolerance to deal with California compliance. We'll all still be able to get all the parts for our different firearms projects from the big dogs like Brownell and Midway USA. But from a lot of the smaller vendors, they're almost certainly going to stop shipping direct to California. I know a few of my favorite vendors who make some more niche products that I've used in firearms builds in the past have already stated that they just won't be able to comply with the new regulations, so they're just stopping all shipments to California. I didn't really get into the ludicrous nature of the 3D printing files ban, but I'll say this. There are plenty of designs for entirely homemade firearms that depend on simple, common tools that use essentially no real firearms parts in their construction. And the files are already online, so good luck purging the internet. People in communist China managed to avoid their extreme state of censorship of the internet, and California politicians only dream about having that level of control. To sum it all up, the only real effects that the average gun owner is going to notice is slightly more paperwork when they purchase firearms-related tools and parts. For my fellow gun nerds, we'll just be slightly more limited in our choice of niche aftermarket accessories and where we can buy them. There will almost certainly be zero effect on the crime using homemade firearms, and any legislator that seriously believes this is either stupid or lying. They passed this law to make our lives more difficult as gun owners in California and give themselves another tool to launch frivolous lawsuits against the gun industry. Anyway, thanks for listening. If you found what I had to say interesting or helpful, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. You can follow me on Instagram at 2atacticaldad, where I'll post random stuff I think is amusing or projects I'm currently working on. As always, I've been the 2A Tactical Dad, and as I like to say, we could all be a little more free and a lot more self-reliant. All it takes is a little responsibility. Also, don't forget to spread the word, guys. The only way we win is through educating as many folks as possible. We won't convince the folks that see no societal benefit to an armed society, but we can probably convince the fence sitters that harassing gun owners is political theater to avoid solving the state's real problems.